So welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. Well, I've been thinking about forest gardens and how we can grow better to achieve more, not just in terms of what we produce, but how it's good for us as well as for nature. So I'm doing a real science dive this week. So I've contacted Andrew Walton, who this year wrote a really important paper. So I'm going to read the title of the paper before we say hi. It's Modelling a Nature Analogous Polyculture Within a Temperate Garden System. I've got to be honest, listeners, there's one or two words there I had to look up. But that's the point of podcasting, isn't it? So welcome to Andrew. Hi.
Hi Sharon, thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. So let's first of all start off with a layman's way of saying modelling a nature analogous polyculture within a temperate garden system. Help us out there.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to just clarify what I mean by a nature analogous species. And that's a species that fills an ecological niche whilst provisioning ecosystem services, which are things like food, fibre and medicine. To give you some context to that paper, there's already been a lot of research already undertaken by authors such as David Jack and Eric Toensmeyer, who have pioneered forest gardening in North America. But what they were looking at when they talked about nature analogousness or ecosynthesis was how an entire habitat could be designed so that it mimics, say, a woodland habitat, a semi-natural woodland. And that's because forest gardens have all the components of a woodland in things like canopy trees, sub-canopy trees, which might be your fruit and nut trees, generally speaking, shrubs, herbaceous plants, and also ground cover species. So what I tried to do with my paper was zone in on each component of those successional layers. So for instance, the canopy trees or the fruit and nut trees, and to say, well, are there species that are literally analogous to that species that could be planted to fill a similar ecological niche as one that may grow under a process of natural succession, but which actually delivers more for us because it provides food or it provides medicine or indeed timber.
Okay, so by analogous species you mean not necessarily the typical species you might find in the area, but something that provides is similar. Is similar in what way? In terms of what it produces or what it looks like or the shape or size or
Sure.
all of those?
So, yeah, so I'll give you a couple of examples. One that probably a lot of people on the periphery of forest gardening will be familiar with is alder, and I believe that is analogous with birch. Now, birch is a
Okay.
perfectly good tree to include within a forest garden system because it produces fuel wood. You can actually tap the tree to get sap out of it in the spring. And it's also very good at mineralising the soil with its leaf litter. However, if you're looking to plant on a site that is particularly nitrogen deficient, you may choose to plant some species of alder. In the paper, it's actually Ulmus cordata, which is Italian alder. And that's because its root nodules have an actinorhizal symbiosis with bacteria called Frankia. And that means that it can actually fix nitrogen into the soil and then deliver those benefits to other plants within the system, which then facilitates their growth. Now, that's the benefit that it adds. I'm saying that it's analogous because physiologically, I think that it's quite a similar tree. It's a pioneer species. It has a moderately dense canopy. It has catkins. And it grows to roughly the same size. I've gone into a bit more detail in the paper that I've written, and I've tried to be as detailed as I can. But what I would say is that I think that there is scope for the research that I've done to be taken forward and to develop much further. I think it's a very preliminary approach that I've taken.
See, I love that. So, Ornus cordata or Ornus glutinosa, or any Ornus species, they're absolutely fabulous, aren't they? On a sort of fairly rubbish ground, where you need to get things going because I mean, nature is wonderful as we know, and they'll just grab that nitrogen, fix it in the soil so that other trees and plants which don't have that skill, I'm going to call it, can get going. Whereas birch, I mean, birch proliferates on open ground, but not, listeners, on roof gardens. If you've been listening carefully to Tree Lady Talks, where we talked to Alistair Bayford about trees on buildings, but birches are a really great pioneer species. But I guess to people who aren't tree folk, they kind of look similar, as you say, but both have their place. That's really interesting. Tell us about the next layer down.
Okay, yeah. So if we look at, I mean, cherry is a slightly smaller tree. So Prunus avium, for example, is another lowland species that you would find in woodlands. It does produce edible fruit, but probably not of the best quality for us, if we're being choosy. And so within the Prunus genus, there are actually, I would argue, lots of functional ecological analogues. Um, and the one that I've grown actually in my garden is Prunus cerasus, which is the morello cherry.
Oh,
Um,
delicious. Let's be honest. I'm sorry,
yeah.
Andrew, but sometimes, if you're doing a long survey, I'm sure that many tree folk will relate to this, and no one's looking. I'll scoff the Prunus cerasifera because I absolutely love those cherries. They're thick and juicy and yummy, and obviously nature loves them too. But often I get there first.
Well, it's an important point you make because if you're introducing these species because you want to, there's some kind of economic reason for you creating the forest garden, you want additional products on your farm, for example, then you do need to think about the marketability of things that you're growing. And obviously, Morello cherry is a cherry that everyone's familiar with. It markets itself, and it makes sense to plant that in place of something like Prunus avium if you're looking for high yields of good quality cherries. But in many other aspects, that tree is functionally and physiologically very similar to the tree that you're sort of replacing it with, is what I argue in my paper.
It's not bad. I can play a bit of devil's advocate with you now. I mean, Prunus avium can make a really tall, large tree, actually. You often see it in urban areas, in cities where it's been crown
Yeah.
lifted and you have this big canopy, whereas Prunus cerasifera is a slightly more scrubby and lots of crossing branches and a denser habit, prone quite a lot to sort of physiological issues, but it is certainly more productive with fruit. Yeah, interesting. And so, any other sort
So,
of analogous species?
it,
I'm worried I haven't
yeah, I
said
mean,
that right.
would you like me to stick with trees, Sharon, or do you want me to
Yeah,
move
no,
to a
let's go for
different?
the whole lot. No, I want to know the whole lot. You certainly don't have to stick with trees.
I mean, we could move down to the shrub layers. So,
Yeah.
bramble, is a fantastic uh, plant. It produces delicious berries. It takes over and colonizes an area very quickly, and it can grow in very different soils. Um, However, for the purposes of a forest garden, you may decide that it's too vigorous, particularly if you do want herbaceous and a ground cover layer. And therefore, I looked at analogues for bramble. And there are other plants within the same genus, such as raspberry, Rubus um, which, although it suckers, I think that it doesn't sprawl and spread in the same way that bramble does, and so may allow you to develop those other layers. So that was what was included in my paper. I did also consider Nepalese raspberry, which is a non-native plant to the UK. It looks physiologically very similar to bramble, has the same type of flowers. It also produces edible fruits, but it doesn't really grow any more than about 10 centimeters high. Um, it's actually more of a ground cover species than it is a shrub, I would argue. And that's why I excluded it from the paper. But you can see that there are species that are fairly analogous within the same genus as bramble.
Well, who doesn't love a raspberry? And they are a pleasure to pick, whereas blackberries, I attest to many tree surveys where I've been scoffing blackberries along the way, and purple stained fingers and lots of thorns, and also the thing is with brambles, they're a fantastic plant, but they can choke younger trees, certainly at a certain stage, and limit some ground cover as well. So that's really interesting. And what about the final layer, the herb? Well, we have 5 layers. We've had 3 so far.
Yeah, so we'll go down to the herbaceous layer now. This is what really sparked me to actually write the paper, because I'd planted sweet Sicily, Mira sodorata, in my forest garden, basically just because I liked the taste of the seeds, which are edible. They taste like aniseed, and the leaves. But when I was out walking in a nature reserve earlier in the year, I was observing the cow parsley that was growing in a woodland ride edge. And it just struck me how similar that plant was to the sweet Sicily. It looked like it was filling a very similar ecological niche to me. Had the same coloured flowers, they're umbelliferous. So when I went home, I did a bit of research, and actually that is also in the same taxonomic family as sweet Sicily. So again, to me, that's an analogous plant. So the cow parsley, I actually did think, I must confess, and I wrote this in my paper, that there was no medicinal uses for it, but there are, in fact. It's since come to light. However, it's still, I would argue, not as palatable as sweet Sicily, so, therefore that's why I chose the sweet Sicily. On that as well, both plants are very similar to hemlock, which is extremely poisonous, so you do need to make sure that you know what you're eating if you grow those.
So that's 4 layers, but there's 5. You're right, it's possible to have 5 layers of plants. And we're going to come on to the why in a moment a bit more.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll just go into the last layer then, and that would be the ground cover. I selected bluebell. It's a much loved plant. It's well known. It grows, in many lowland woodland habitats. However, it's of little benefit to humans beyond the amenity benefits, I would argue. You certainly can't eat it. And so looking through the list of plants that were most analogous to it that I could find, I found wild garlic, which often does grow, yeah, exactly, in the same setting as bluebell. It has edible leaves. It spreads in a carpet-like fashion in the same way. And although it's not in the same taxonomic family, it is part of the same taxonomic order as bluebell, and grows on fairly similar soils.
So let's talk Latin here, because we've got a lovely non-English speaking audience here. So we're talking about Hyacinthzoid non-scriptus, and I cannot remember the Latin name for wild garlic.
Allium ursinum.
So Allium ursulum, I do pick that. In fact, we own a little narrow strip of woodland. It's 6 metres wide on the other side of the road, and it's about about 60 metres long, on a raised bank. And I'm going to plant some wild garlic there this weekend, because I love cooking with wild garlic. In fact, I've made it into pesto. I've had it raw in salads, and it became quite a thing in lockdown that people were harvesting wild garlic, and you can see it in London at ridiculous prices. But of course, those of us who live in the country, it's part of our culture to eat it. So that's really interesting then. But so you found plants which are similar in terms of how they fit into the ecology, which provide more benefits to us. So tell us, just go back to first principles. What do you mean by a productive forest garden?
So I think forest gardens can deliver the entire range of ecosystem services, regulating cultural and provisioning, as well as forget what's the fourth one, Sharon, that sits underneath all of those.
Do you mean, well, I've got loads of food, fibre, medicine, social
It's
benefits.
yeah. Basically, it provides all of those ecosystem services that I just mentioned. Um, and provisioning for me is one that you don't get out of many habitat creation schemes presently. We create a lot of woodland habitat because it's good for biodiversity, and that is definitely the right thing to do. But I think that we're missing a trick by not delivering more provisioning ecosystem services from the food that we grow. Um, the reason that I think that is because in this country we only produce about 62% of the food that we actually grow.
Wow.
Sorry, of the food that we actually eat in this country. I can break that down further. We only produce
Yeah.
53% of the vegetables, and only 16% of the fruit that's eaten in this country is actually produced here in a temperate climate with fantastic soils.
Wow. That's just ridiculous because we have a long culture in the UK of growing fruit and sort of vegetables and market gardens. And yet, I can tell you now, in the southeast and around London, many housing schemes are looking to go onto old nurseries, and you just have these literally acres of broken down greenhouses. But I mean, it's something's a bit broken here, isn't it? And also, we know there's a massive disconnect between people's food they're buying from a supermarket and their understanding of where it comes from with some sectors of people, not everybody. And I think there's a real problem with people eating ultra processed food and
Yeah.
all the multiple physical and mental health problems that brings. And really, we are trying to sort of encourage people to eat well and eat local. And it seems to me that forest gardens are part of that solution, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that forest gardens lend themselves really well to something called agroecological urbanism. And this is a sort of intellectual discourse that just seems to be emerging at the moment. It's even been encouraged by the Food and Agriculture Organization. And, you know, they're talking about how we should try and weave foodscapes into our urban environment because that will help to nurture a greater understanding of where food comes from, of how to grow it. And I think that is something that we've lost. In the book that I'm reading at the moment, The Resourcing and Agroecological Urbanism, there's talk of an epistemic rift between urban people and and the ability to grow food. If you look at the historical context of England, obviously through the land enclosures that occurred from the 1400s and then intensified in the 1700s, prior to that, people were growing food in their own environment, in their urban conurbation, and because of those land enclosures, that food growing space has been taken away, and with it, the skills and the ability to grow the food. And I think if you go to say, we go to an apple day at Walsall Arboretum every year where they harvest the apples, and you can see how just that little process of harvesting the food and then eating it communally brings people together. And I think
Yes.
that there's a role to be played in growing food in an urban environments where you can actually utilize that to build community as well.
I agree. People coming together, perhaps they don't know each other to begin with. It's likely to be all sorts of different ages and backgrounds, having a shared experience, which is just quite frankly wholesome and fun. I mean, we
Yep.
hear so much about social disconnect, about people spending too much time on screens. Well, let's get them out, touching nature and eating the produce of it. So I
Yeah.
think this is really benefits so many different ways. But are forest gardens new?
Okay, yeah, so I was talking about that sort of conceptual framework that authors have put together like at the turn of this century, but obviously they're sort of borrowing from indigenous traditional ecological knowledge that has existed possibly for thousands of years. And
Yeah.
the best example of that can be found in the Amazon. Um, there
So
was a
tell us about
research,
that.
yeah, there was a research paper that came out in 2017, and the authors had studied pre-Columbian archaeological sites, so that's sites that existed before 1492, I believe. And around each one of those sites, they found up to 16,000 species of plant. However, about half of all the trees that existed around those sites were made up of just 1% of those 16,000 species.
Oh.
And that 1% was actually domesticated species of plant. Some that we might be familiar with are the Brazil nut tree and the cocoa plant.
Oh,
And,
very
and so that
familiar.
shows,
Frankly, every day, Andrew, I have Brazil
yeah,
nuts and I have 80 or 90% dark chocolate. I can't live without either thing every single day.
I don't have the dark, I have the milk, unfortunately, which is probably a
Oh,
bit more fattening, but
and I just love dark chocolate.
yeah. So, I mean, what's amazing about that for me is that these cultures were creating taxonomically diverse, extremely resilient ecosystems. They're the most biodiverse ecosystems on terrestrial landscape in the world. But they were also producing most of the food and the medicine and the fibre that they needed to live. And I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learnt from that. You know, the way we farm at the moment, I know that the tide is turning, but you know, for the last 50 years we've been farming soils to the point where they're not really productive anymore. There's no biodiversity on them. I went to a woodland creation site just the other day, and it had previously been a farmed landscape, and the soil was completely dead. There were no worms in it. There was no biodiversity, no birds. So, you know, doing the woodland creation now is actually going to hopefully put a lot of that back and try and regenerate the area. But I think that we can do that with forest gardens whilst also producing food.
Yes, and you say it's not just food, is it? I mean, people are rediscovering age-old crafts of, say, using plants to dye things, to make dyes for cloth and for art, medicinal properties. There's a great interest in non-mainstream pharmaceutical treatments, chamomile tea, for example, and there's a whole host of use for herbs as well. And I think we're going back to something that is ancient. We're going back again to ancient wisdom to try and fix where we've just had this sort of sanitized, compartmentalized, slightly lonely life. And I'm actually really excited by this. And I also like the word that you use, resilience. Speak to the resilience of forest gardens when they're going well.
Yeah. So, you know, within forestry, we encourage schemes to look at planting, you know, as a minimum of sort of 3 to 5 species of canopy tree species. And that's because if there is a shock from pests or diseases that afflicts, you know, one species in particular, you've still got 4 species within that woodland, and therefore the woodland is resilient to those shocks and will continue to have canopy cover. Obviously, the fewer species there are, the less resilient that woodland is. I've recently been to a woodland creation scheme just to sort of check that it was all going along nicely. I think this was about 15 years post-planting, and they'd put quite a lot of ash in there, which has been decimated, but they'd also planted another 4 or 5 species, and therefore that woodland is still going to turn into a closed canopy woodland, and it just speaks to the resilience that you can achieve by having species diversity.
Yes, we hear this more and more, and sometimes in more formal planting, there's a tension between trying to create some visually striking uniformity, say, of an avenue of single species. But I think outside of that, I think diversity is the key, and not just with different species, you get different structure as well, and different heights, and creating almost microclimates and micro habitats as well. So it's absolutely great. So it needs to be a real shift in thinking, and I think it's happening, but it's not all there yet.
Could I add to that, Sharon?
Yes, do.
I think one thing we are guilty of in the industry is when we talk about resilience is only thinking about the ecological resilience of landscapes. Yeah. And I do think that forest gardens also add to the economic resilience of a landscape, in theory at least, by adding that additional food that is accessible. And if there is a shock, during COVID, I think 26% of large businesses, their supply chains were disrupted, and that makes us vulnerable when we rely so heavily on imported food. And so if you've got, you can walk out your door and there are things that you can eat, that adds resilience in my book.
Do you know, I'm so glad you raised this, because resilience is not just about the number of different plants you're planting. We do need to be resilient against shocks. And I think back to lockdown, where I dug up the end of my old garden and created this vegetable patch, and because of Noel was extremely clinically vulnerable, I didn't even go to the shop, so until we had online shopping, which took a while because of the waiting list, we ate some of the things that we grew. It was the only time I did it well, listeners. I've been too busy after that. But I notice in London, walking around, an increasing number of raised planters with fruit and veg in them. And in my work in planning and construction, it's become normal now to talk about food growing areas, whereas probably only 2 years ago, when I was championing this for quite a long time, there was a sort of misunderstanding or even resistance, or but actually it is a growing movement, which is really, really heartening, because there are times where you just need to go out and just grab something to eat. And we know about the educational benefits, and we've discussed the community benefits of that. But you never really know what's round the corner. So why not build in food and nature on your doorstep? That's great.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, one of the things I'd like to talk to you about is, well, how would you define native? Because you talked about the Nepalese raspberry for a moment. Is there a problem with using that, or should we be open-minded?
Yeah, so for the purposes of my paper, I'd actually defined native as a site-native species, and I'd helped to clarify that by referring to the National Vegetation Classification System, which used various ecological habitat surveys to draw out some general groupings or species assemblages that you would expect to find on certain soils at certain altitudes. However, I think that we get a bit hung up, in my personal opinion, it's definitely not the opinion of the Forestry Commission or anyone else, so I'd clarify that. But I think we get a bit hung up with the idea of native, and what one of the reasons that I've done this research, I think, is because there are lots of analogous species out there that are not native, but they are very similar plants. They're taxonomically very similar, and I think that as long as we are making sure that they're being put into systems that are being managed, and to be honest, all woodlands should be managed, because we haven't got all of the key ecosystem components of them, and they rely on our management in order for them to function properly. For instance, there's no top predators. So I think that if you're putting something in for a specific management objective and you are managing it, then there shouldn't be an issue. There are obviously some known invasive species that are listed on the gov.uk website, and of course we would not want to plant any of those. Funnily enough, there are some very good agroforestry species, including Hippophaya rhamnoides, which is sea buckthorn,
Yeah.
and Elaeagnus umbellata, which is autumn olive. Now, they actually produce unique fruits because they contain um, saturated fats, which is very rare for a temperate fruit. So they're like very,
Oh.
very nutritious. They also fix nitrogen. However, there are qualms within the industry about planting these two species precisely because they're thought to potentially be invasive.
Yeah, but I mean, I can never say. Sea buckthorn is really good though in coastal areas, isn't it? Where the number of plants that do grow well is limited. Elaeagnus is a good all-rounder, but sea buckthorn is a specialist. But also, you see a cultivar of sea buckthorn planted as a street tree in London,
Hmm.
which
Okay.
is was quite surprising the first time I saw it. But
Wow.
no, that's a really great example. And going back to forest gardens, am I right in thinking these could be any size? I mean, how small can we go?
Well, my back garden is pretty small, I would argue. I've managed to squeeze about 8 or 9 fruit and nut trees in there, some understory species, some fruiting shrubs, and herbaceous layer. I think I'm actually guilty of planting some things too close together, and I'm going to have to try and manage those creatively in the future. And that is a common mistake to make with forest garden design, not allowing enough light and space for things to grow. Obviously, you can thin things out though if you need to, or maybe even coppice them. Like I've got 2 hazels which I'll coppice. I think the question isn't how small can you go. The question is how large can we go with
Yeah.
forest gardens. And I would love to see people experimenting with this to push the limits really, to see if we can make nature analogous, habitats on scale. Um, I think that we're always looking for a mosaic of habitats in the ideal habitat creation design, and you can have woodland and forest gardens side by side. Forest gardens are very much an ecotone habitat, um, sort of somewhere between grassland and full forest. And so I think that there's plenty of scope to integrate forest gardens within those niches.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, I can see this and have seen this on new, very large developments whereby, a footpath, a cycleway, you may have a sustainable urban drainage system on one side, and then you've got the sort of tree belt with fruit and nut bushes underneath, and then wild garlic, for example. So it is happening, but I'm seeing it more at the design stage at this point. But I think then as education, but we must always bring the community alongside us and hear about maybe the culture of the local population is very mixed, and that's really exciting. And they people might have fresh ideas of what we can try and grow, different sorts of fruit and vegetables, and really create that diversity that speaks to the cultural and ethnic diversity of an area, which is all for the good. That's brilliant. There's something else that we haven't tapped on here. 2 things come to my mind. There is a movement for tiny forests, a Milwaukee method.
Hmm.
This to me is not that, because those trees in tiny forests are literally planted very, very close together. Is that
Yeah.
your understanding? Do you see them as being 2 separate movements?
I think the principles could still apply, of dense plantings, but you wouldn't necessarily plant lots of trees densely together. You maybe have the tree at the central point of a guild of plants that could be planted quite densely together in order to shade out weed competition. So you could maybe plant some of the shrubs and the herb layers quite densely together around those trees. But yeah, I think there is a distinction between Miyawaki and forest gardens.
The other thing where I think this is a wonderful opportunity, Biodiversity net gain. So here in England and Wales, biodiversity net gain is a mandatory requirement for new developments. And for listeners who haven't heard, there's a couple of really great episodes on Tree Lady Talks. One with Simon Thomas earlier this season, and one with both friends of the show, Julian Forbes Laird, specifically talking about issues with veteran trees. So biodiversity net gain is really changing the face of what our new developments will look like. And as part of that, there's a lot of discussion about tree retention, etc., and new planting. But I think that I'm hoping that, this is my personal view, biodiversity net gain is going to be refined and improved. It's a first iteration. But wouldn't it be great if productive landscapes was at the heart of that? So you'll get your biodiversity net gain with retained new trees, new shrubs, ground cover, lower shrub and perennial layer, and that there's credits. There might be, actually. Hey listeners, if I've got this wrong, you know where to find me, treeladytalks@gmail.com, or direct message me on LinkedIn. But I think if we could have productive landscapes at the heart of BNG, that it was an extra metric point credit, then that could be really impactful on our new communities, particularly as we're looking to build. That's this government's mantra, although I think I may have heard that before from other governments. And there is a significant push for new development. Let's plant a load of productive landscapes. What are your observations on the impact of biodiversity net gain and forest gardens so far?
I think that so far, Sharon, I haven't really seen any biodiversity net gain projects up close. I completely agree with you that it would be fantastic if productivity was put front and centre of all habitat creation projects in forestry. You know, a lot of forest woodland creation schemes at the moment are not focused enough on producing timber, I think, and we could say the same now about food production. With biodiversity net gain, my limited understanding of it is that the easier it is to get some wins, the better in some ways. And so for that reason, things like scrub habitat, although they don't score highly as a habitat, although I think that they arguably should, they would generally be looked on in high regard because they can be delivered quite quickly and quite easily. Forest gardens need fairly intensive management, and so I'm not sure how much that will be a priority for biodiversity net gain policymakers, but I would certainly like to see it.
So, biodiversity net gain policymakers, you heard it here on Tree Lady Talks. We think that this is a significant opportunity for new developments to have diversity and resilience in all sense of the word, not just to do with plants, but to do with people. It speaks to social cohesion, new community building, and people's well-being getting actively involved. This is a mechanism to think beyond the confines of just how many plants where, but really how many people will benefit, and as well as nature. I love this, so I think further work is to be done. So Andrew, this sounds great. Have you got any great examples of a successful forest garden?
Well, I am aware of something called the Fruit and Nut Village, which is being produced, grown, facilitated in parts of Birmingham. I think around I don't know if you're familiar with Birmingham, Sharon, but I think there's a place called Sturchley where a lot of that work is happening at the moment. And that's, I think it's a community interest company. They're actually, there's quite a lot of people from the community helping to deliver that. And it looks like they've recently obtained funding to try and employ 3 people to work on the project part-time as well. So that I would argue it looks like a successful project. the other really good example for me is Martin Crawford's Forest Garden. I mean, the community element of it, I'm not so sure of because I think he put a lot of work into that on his own to start with. But he obviously is offering employment to people in the local area now who are inspired by his work. I think Martin Crawford deserves a shout because I think that his work is extremely inspiring, and I don't know how he does it really because he doesn't
Wow.
just yeah, it doesn't just manage the forest. He's got a nursery. He's producing lots of plants to sell to people so they can start their own forest gardens. He writes books. He does online training events.
Martin Crawford, if you're listening, I want to know you. That's absolutely amazing. And I hear anecdotally of many successful projects like this, certainly food growing anyway, and you see them on mainstream media as well. So a growing movement, but you also spoke then about another benefit, employment.
Hmm.
You know, people developing new skills. I see often on mainstream media, and I've worked with MenCap, which is a mental health charity in the UK, growing fruit and vegetables and managing a woodland in the past. And it's about confidence building. It's about trying something new. And we also know about touching the soil and getting our hands dirty with good soil, that it's good for our gut biome, it's good for our health, it's good for our brain, the whole gut brain axis thing. So it seems to me that the work you've done, Andrew, has really drilled down into the multiple benefits and the practical application of forest gardens. So thank you so much. And I just want to leave listeners with a quote I found in your paper about the Native Americans, that there was a feeling that it was the work they were doing was so entwined with the natural environment that you could scarcely call it agriculture. It seemed to me an entire way of life. I paraphrase that, but I think this is a way forward. So, Andrew Walton, thank you so much for your time. And if you're listening to this and you want to find out more, we'll be putting some details in the show notes. And if you're listening to this and you've had a go, let me know. Andrew Walton, thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Sharon, and yeah, really love your show. So keep up the good work. Thank you.